Okay, so we're going to move on to our second speaker of the afternoon. And Pete, again, I just want to say thanks a lot for stepping in this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Um, the subject of Pete's talk is Albert Osborne stroke John Bowen. Now, he was born in Grimsby, and he was an Oswald witness and supposedly rode with him on the bus to Mexico City in September 63. He was known as Osborne, but gave his name to the FBI as John Bowen. And when Oswald was arrested, he was carrying a library card with that name on it. And it's also a name that apparently he used when ordering his Fair Play for Cuba committee leaflets. So he's an interesting gentleman. So I'm going to hand you over to Pete Mellor so we can find out more about him. Over to you, Pete.
Okay, this kicked off really from the Education Forum, talking to Larry Hancock of various subjects, and he asked me to do a presentation for this Lancer. When I picked myself up off the floor, I thought, well, all I can do is what I've been doing with the subject of Osborne. So, I mean, I've never considered myself anything of a researcher, just an avid book reader on the assassination. So how this all started was back in 2017. A researcher, John Kowalski, placed a request in DPUK's journal, the Dealey Plaza Echo, for someone in the UK to assist with research into Albert Osborne. And I knew that Osborne was from Grimsby. But this copy of the Echo I was reading in 2019. So I had to send an inquiry to Richard, and had anybody replied to this and taken up this request, and that was negative. So I was given John's email, and that's what started this looking into Albert Osborne. John Kowalski is in Ottawa, in Canada. Sadly, with COVID-19, it's had an effect on everything, and libraries and archives are closed. Excuse me, I've just got a hand butty. And so that's sort of curtailed things, really. But in the short time, and it was really this year, in the short time just before all these silly lockdowns, I did find one or two snippets that John Kowalski, it was new to him. So I'm still working with John. So if there's any newcomers in DPUK that's into this murder mystery, I'll give a brief resume of Oswald's involvement in the JFK assassination case. And as Malcolm Blunt, when the subject is raised concerning Mexico City, I think Malcolm's comment is, it's a swamp. And I concur wholeheartedly. So don't ask me about Mexico City. I'm not going there, even on a red arrow bus. But the answer to some of the claims about him that have appeared in print over the years. It's all strange stuff. But first of all, I'll keep a chronological format, begin at the beginning with Albert's family in Grimsby and his career in the British Army. I did make contact with a family member still alive who met Albert, and I'll come to that at the end. That was also strange. But then again, you know, it's a strange world. So Albert Osborne was born in Grimsby on the 12th of November, 1888. Now, you'll often find that his name is referred to as Albert Alexander Osborne, and that was Albert's invention and one of many inventions to his name and other details. He was simply baptized Albert Osborne, no middle name, and that was on the 29th of December, 1888. Grimsby, as it has been fairly recently, it's on the North Sea coast, and it's been a busy fishing port going up to the North Sea, up to the Arctic, for many years, and it was in the 19th century as well. Albert's father was James Osborne, was a fisherman, and it was the industry to go into. You were lucky if you escaped it. The 1891 census shows James Osborne absent from the home. So he was obviously somewhere bouncing up and down off Iceland or something, fishing. And as I'd done the same in the 1970s, it's not a pleasant occupation. And what it was like in the 1890s, I dread to think. The Merchant Navy, we had a saying that then ships were made of wood and men were made of steel, and now it's the bloody other way around. Anyway, let me tell you about the rest of the family. His wife, James Osborne's wife, Emily, she was looking after the family in 1891, and it was quite a large family, as lots of families were then. James H. was the oldest son, aged 18, and he was at home, but he was also, his occupation was a fisherman. And there was another couple of sons, aged 17, William. He was a canvas sail maker, and Frank was 14 years old, and he was another sail maker, followed by daughters Rhoda, 13, Rosetta, 12, son Arthur, 9, daughters Emily, 8, Ada, 6, son Walter, 5, and then our Albert at 2 years old. And last but by no means least was daughter Florrie, who was 8 months old. So It was like shelling peas. After his schooling, Albert Osborne found work away from the fishing fleet, and he was employed as a grocer. So he'd left school. It was a good few years. He'd left school probably at 14 or maybe less at that time, until he was a grocer until the age of 18, when he enlisted into the British Army. So after a basic year stationed in England, he was farmed out to the 1st Battalion Lincolnshire Regiment, and he saw service abroad, firstly in India for about 3 or 4 years. In 1911, the Lincolnshires were then sent to Aden for a year, and that was followed by a 2-year duty in Gibraltar, and that's where he was in January of 1914, where he was shipped out to with the regiment to Bermuda. So after just 5 months in Bermuda, which took us to June 1914, Albert Osborne resigned his commission. Now, that was an exceedingly propitious time to get yourself out of the British Army in June of 1914. Both parents, it seems, were by this time deceased, because on his paperwork, his next of kin was listed as the elder brother James, who was by that time aged about 42. And Albert was 24 years old in 1914, obviously still single. So he didn't have much to return home to England for. And obviously, in his 7 years of service, Osborne saw no military action, and he remained with the basic rank of private, and all his paperwork states is he got a pass in first aid and stretcher drill. Anyway, after his army discharge, say without going back to Grimsby, it appears that its next port of call was the United States. And from newspaper clippings, we find that Albert Osborne was involved in missionary work and giving presentations and lectures to religious organizations like the Seventh-day Adventists, and he'd give lectures on the peoples of India and other countries. Although he'd never been to Egypt, he was giving presentations on the peoples of Egypt as well, among other things. And that was a trend that would continue with Osborne. In later years, sometimes in the guise of John Howard Bowen. However, in 1917, with the war still raging in Europe, Albert Osborne surprisingly turned up in Toronto, Canada, and on the 2nd of August 1917, he enlisted in the Canadian Army, giving his address on the enlistment papers as Nashville, Tennessee. These forms, not unsurprisingly, give some incorrect information. He stated on the form that his year of birth was 1885, which instead of 1888. And he gave his full name as Albert Victor Emmanuel Osborne. And that would not be the last invention of Osborne's middle names, largely resulting in the enigma that he became. Now, going back to John Kowalski, he's written a story entitled The Dual Life of Albert Osborne, and I think that was the article that he sent to the Dealey Plaza Echo. And that includes a fascinating collection of documents, newspaper stories on Osborne and his alias John Bowen. And that covers the time period of what we're talking about now, from his World War I to Osborne's death. And you want to catch up on that if you haven't got that Echo. That's available on Jim D'Eugenio's Kennedys and King website, which is a place that I'm visiting quite often, really, but also on the net. And a guy that's on the education forum as well, another researcher, Ron Ecker, he posted a piece entitled "From Grimsby with Love, the Travels of the Reverend Albert Alexander Osborne." And Ron posted that back in 2005. So, continuing the story, from 1919, when he was discharged from the Canadian Army, Osborne spent the following over 4 decades seemingly traveling around the US and Mexico. Sometimes he was reported as an itinerant gardener or a lecturer on India or a missionary, but without any solid employment. He became a member of the First Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. And while there, he was a founder of an organization called the Campfire Council, which was, and that was in Knoxville, which was an organization for the welfare of underprivileged boys and girls. And he also made claims of missionary work with Mixteca Indians in Mexico. Sometimes he would use the epithet of doctor or reverend as Osborne or Bowen. Osborne even applied for a social security number under the name of Bowen. So this has been a mystery in many books. Many researchers seem a bit confused about whether it's John Howard Bowen, alias Albert Osborne, or Albert Osborne, alias John Howard Bowen. John Kowalski has sorted this mystery. John Howard Bowen was born in Pennsylvania in 1880, and he worked for the YMCA from around 1910 right to the 1930s in various locations, but ending up in Hamlet, North Carolina. Now, John proposes that Bowen and Osborne came together in the 1920s, and he found a newspaper article that places both men in the same place at the same time. And this newspaper article is from the Charlotte Observer, that's dated December the 24th, 1929, stating that Dr. Albert B. Osborne of India spoke Sunday morning at the Methodist Church here while the devotional services were conducted by J.H. Bowen, General Secretary of the YMCA at Hamlet. So the question is this when Osborne lifted Bowen's identity? The real John Bowen was involved in a car accident and died from his injuries in January 1962. So it's not known when exactly Osborne began using this alias of John Bowen, using his identity. He gave various times to the FBI. But Osborne had a sister, Ada, and she actually moved as well to the United States and lived in Gary, Indiana. And the Bureau traced Ada and inquired about this, and she said that that she'd sent her brother money in the 1920s, care of John Howard Bowen. So these are the questions, and they remain. Why was Osborne using this alias? What for? Why was he adding the various epithets to his name? And another question, how did he finance for so long his travels around the States, his back and forth wanderings from the 1930s all the way to 1964 across the US-Mexican border as an itinerant preacher or missionary? What was he? Was he a shill, a confidence trickster, or as some have suspected, an intelligence agent or asset? And if he was, who for? This, take a good look at this photograph, folks. I don't know whether you can. That's Albert Osborne.
Yeah, we can see that, Pete.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's clear.
Yeah. I'll come back to this photograph because of what's in the background of it. And it is, I can, although the background is blurred, I can just make out a sign down one of the buildings saying savings. So it's some English speaking. It's not in Europe, likely in the United States, could be Canada. But I'd like to know more about that photograph, and we'll return later on. Okay. So we now come to the swamp. Osborne's links to the JFK case. Now, most people know of the Fletcher Roja, the Red Arrow bus journey, but for any newcomers to the case, we'll do a brief resume of these strange details. As the story goes, Lee Harvey Oswald travelled on a Continental Trailways bus from Houston to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and there he boarded the Fletcher Roja bus to Mexico City. Also boarding this bus, according to his tourist card, was one John Howard Bowen. We know the real Bowen was 6 feet under at this point. So perhaps the reason Osborne was using this alias then was because Osborne had been reportedly ordered to leave Mexico as an undesirable alien back in 1958, as reported in the FBI's Warren Commission exhibit, which is CE 2195. According to English-speaking witnesses on the bus, a Dr. John McFarland and his wife Merrill, who were from Liverpool, England, they sat in front of Bowen, and sat next to Bowen was Oswald. Oswald, they stated, told them that he was secretary of the New Orleans branch of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he was on his way to Cuba to see Castro. Other witnesses who boarded the same bus, but at Monterey, were 2 Australian girls, Pamela Mumford and Patricia Winston, who also stated that they spoke briefly with Oswald and Bowen. When the FBI produced photographs for these 2 men, these witnesses gave positive identifications. Bowen left Mexico City by bus and arrived back in the States on October the 2nd, one day before Oswald was supposedly back in the States. John Armstrong in Harvey and Lee points out that that there was a roster of bus passengers, and the roster was signed by each passenger. And these are Warren Commission documents 2129 and 2482. And this list contained the names of Dr. John McFarland and his wife Merrill and John Howard Bowen, but not the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, H.O. Lee, or any variation thereof, and not the name, also missing, were the 2 Australian girls. So it's just part of the swamp. So I'll move on. Leave Mexico City to Bill Simpich and others. I'm looking forward to Bill Simpich's talk on the Lancer conference, because he's in that area I'll leave all that to other people. After the assassination, the FBI investigated Oswald's supposed trip to Mexico City. I can add that Oswald denied going to Mexico City. I think he said the only time he'd been into Mexico was to Tijuana or something. Anyway, on probing the Red Arrow bus journey, they found that Mexican authorities had already removed both original and duplicate copies of the bus passenger lists, manifest. So by other means, the FBI discovered the names of the fellow travellers on the Red Arrow bus, and they traced the McFarlanes, traced Mumford and Winston, but not surprisingly, they couldn't locate John Howard Bowen. As mentioned, the FBI investigation is contained in CE 2195, and that's about a 90-page document. And it states that on January the 7th, 64, FBI agent T4 interviewed the Reverend Albert Osborne, and this was in Mexico. And he claimed he didn't know the whereabouts of John Howard Bowen, but thought he resided in the United States. And then there was a follow-up interview on February the 14th, 64 in Laredo, Texas, that had Bowen Osborne even deny he'd been interviewed in January. It's complicated, but Osborne was still maintaining that he was John Howard Bowen. So on this second interview, so obviously he had to deny that he'd been spoken to in January by the Phoebes. He still lied about his real identity. He denied being on a bus with any English-speaking peoples, and he stated that he was sat next to a Hispanic male, and when shown a photograph of Oswald, he couldn't identify the man. And then finally, on March the 5th, 1964, this is now the third time Osborne was interviewed again, this time at the YMCA in Nashville. At first, he continued with the Bowen alias, but eventually he admitted that he had lied to the FBI, and he provided his real Albert Osborne details, explaining that he had used the John Howard Bowen alias because it sounded more American. Yet he still maintained that he had sat on the Red Arrow bus with a Mexican male and still denied any knowledge of any English-speaking persons, and still could not ID the photographs of Oswald. So the question here, and I think I know the answer, but the question here is, why wasn't Osborne charged with perjury for lying to the FBI, not once or twice, but 3 times? I wonder if J. Edgar wasn't keen on any court appearance talking about anything to do with bus journeys to Mexico City. But anyway, The Warren report summed up the mysterious travelling preacher in this way. Osborne's responses to federal investigators on matters unrelated to Oswald have proved inconsistent and unreliable, and therefore, based on the contrary evidence and Osborne's lack of reliability, the Commission has attached no credence to his denial that Oswald was beside him on the bus. The Commission went on to conclude that there was no basis for suspecting Osborne of any involvement in the assassination. On October the 10th, 1963, Osborne visited the Canadian Embassy in New Orleans and obtained a new Canadian passport. I have read that this consulate was reputedly in the same building as Clay Shaw's World Trade Center. On November the 13th, 1963, so we're now just over a week away from the assassination, Osborne, traveling under his real name, flew from New York to travel to England to visit his relatives. Now, there's many assassination researchers have expressed suspicions that Osborne should leave the US for the first time in over 50 years, just before events kicked off in Dallas. However, I've discovered that he'd previously visited England, in fact 10 years previously, during the Christmas period of 1953. So it wasn't the first time that he'd come home. At that visit, he presented his great nephew, who was just 3 years old at the time, Darrell Featherstone, with a book of Bible stories for children. And he inscribed on the inside cover, "To Darrell from Uncle Albert, Christmas 1953. In November of 63, Osborne visited his 77-year-old brother, Walter, in a Grimsby nursing home, as well as his sister, Emily, or Lily Featherstone. And it was also at this time that he spent an evening with Lily's son, Byron Featherstone, and his son, Darrell, who was then aged 12. So I did manage to trace Darrell, who's now aged 70 and still living in Grimsby. Now, many books and newspapers have made Osborne responsible for the mysterious phone call to the Cambridge News, supposedly received at 6 p.m. GMT on the 22nd of November, which would be just 30 minutes or so before the actual shooting started in Dealey Plaza, advising them to call the American Embassy in London for some big news. And then the caller hung up. What's strange about this call is that it was never reported in any news outlet, newspaper, say, that would have appeared on the morning of the 23rd. Former Cambridge News editor guy called Keith Whetstone, who was working at the paper at the time of the shooting, said in 1981. It sounds like a completely fictitious story. He added that he'd traced 12 members of staff, the reporting staff, who worked at the paper in 1963, and none of them recalled a telephone call or anybody mentioning it. Former senior reporter, a guy called Jock Gillespie, said there's no way that would have happened without being talked about. That's been a wind-up. Are you sure it isn't Cambridge, Massachusetts they're talking about? Well, while it's true, there are no records that provide the whereabouts of Albert Osborne on the 22nd of November 1963. It's also unclear just where he travelled to after his visit to Grimsby. He told his brother Walter in the nursing home that he was going to travel to Iceland via Prestwick in Scotland with a group of scientists to photograph a volcano. In a letter to Byron Featherstone, which was posted from Mexico on April the 3rd, 1964, and you may not be able to read this, but there's something like, anyway, that's a copy of the letter.
Yeah.
I won't ask you to read that, but I'll read it for you. And it's dated Mexico, April the 13th, 1964. You will think I had almost forgotten, but not at all. Every so often, the scene in your mother's room and the beautiful pictures flash across my mind. I'm very much indebted to you for such an evening. I took some pictures of France and other parts, but they didn't prove very good, except those of North Africa and the Rock. For the past few months, I have been under investigation by the American FBI. They claim that I traveled to Mexico City on September the 25th. A man named Lee Oswald sat next to me, as though nobody knows who Lee Oswald was in April of 1964. A man named Lee Oswald sat next to me and held a conversation with me. While I have not the slightest idea of travelling with such a man, they still are questioning about what he talked about. It is strange in this day and age how a person can get involved. But my conscience is clear on this matter, so why should I worry? I hope the weather is good and that you may enjoy your favourite pastime. Best wishes to all. Yours as always, Albert. Strange letter from a strange guy. Right. Anyway, so that's that letter. So as he says, he writes of taking photographs of France and North Africa. The FBI's investigation stated that he arrived back in the States in New York on December the 5th of 1963 on Icelandic Airways. So there's no shortage of enigmas in the JFK assassination case, and surely Albert Osborne can be included in them. It's a mystery how he financed his many years of wanderings with no known source of regular income, or what the truth was behind the Mexico City trip, and why he used the Bowen alias and altered his true identity for decades. I mean, looking at these trials, just take the Red Arrow bus in September of '63. He's on the buses, he's going to Mexico City and then on from there, and then he's back across the border into the States by early October. Then he's in New Orleans, where he gets his passport, and then he's in New York, flying across the Atlantic. He's visiting relatives in Grimsby, and he's then where he went then, who knows. As I say, that letter to the Featherstones was written from Mexico. So wherever he went, he didn't send any letters. So with no postmarks on anything to prove that he was in France or Spain or North Africa. It's typical of the man, you know. All these are secrets that he took to his grave. He was admitted to the Medical Arts Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. And after 3 days, he died of uremia as a result of kidney failure, which was diagnosed by the hospital as chronic glomerulonephritis, which is, you know, a bit of a mouthful, but basically that's the blood vessels in the kidney are no longer filtering the poisons out of the blood, and it is pretty fatal condition. Certainly, even then, in when Osborne passed away, and his date of death was the 31st of August 1966. So really, it's nothing for Wayne and Belzer to put in their hit list. And he was buried in the San Jose Burial Park in San Antonio on the 7th of September 1966. Here in the UK, both regional and national newspapers, when reporting on Osborne, seem to copy the banner headlines such as Grimsby-born soldier turned Soviet Union spy Albert Osborne, blah, blah, blah. Another one, Grimsby-born Albert Osborne was a Soviet agent who befriended Lee Harvey Oswald. I was trying to suss out where the evidence came from, originated, that linked him as a Soviet agent. And all I can come up with is that this accusation emanates from 2 books by Hugh MacDonald. The first titled Appointment in Dallas, which was then followed up in 1978 by MacDonald and Robin Moore in the book LBJ and the JFK Conspiracy. And that book purports that there was a Soviet plot which began with Khrushchev and KGB guys met with LBJ and coerced him into being involved in this plot, and they required LBJ to send plans of JFK's Dallas trip to a Mr. Albert Osborne at the Hilton Hotel Dallas. There also, there are many books that claim Osborne was running a team of professional hitmen that were based over the border in Mexico. I think this originates from Torbitt's nomenclature of an assassination cabal, and that has Osborne and his men in a safe house at 3126 Harlandale in Oak Cliff, Dallas, on the 22nd of November, 63. And there's variations on that. Theories repeated in Richard Sprague's The Taking of America, which was published in 1985, and Robin Ramsey's Who Shot JFK is another one from 2002, which repeats that, and even the entry in Benson's Who's Who in the JFK assassination gives all this assassination team. Going back, what to make of Myra Silver, secretary of Jones Printing Company in New Orleans, when she gave evidence that a man she understood to give his name as Osborne placed the order for, as Tony has mentioned prior to kicking off, this order for 1,000 hands off Cuba handbills. Jones Printing was next door to Riley Coffee. So, well, Oswald, once could be a mistake, but we also have John Anderson of Mellor's Service Company, Magazine Street, New Orleans, and he identified a photo of Oswald as the man who came to Mellor's on June the 2nd, 1963, and ordered 500 printed copies of a Fair Play for Cuba Committee application form. Anderson, at the time, wrote on the bill the name Lee Osborne. Well, I don't really want to launch another conspiracy theory, but I'm going to. I've long been intrigued in that photograph. There it is again. And what I found interesting, I thought, where's this taken? He's pretty smart. He's in a suit and tie, a pair of glasses in his hand. Looks about, from the FBI mugshots taken in 64, where he looks a lot older, and obviously he is. He's turned 70 something. But here he looks to be in his 50s. So it looks like we're going back to the 1940s somewhere. And I was interested in this motif on the wall. At first, I thought, well, that should help in identifying the building, because it is a bit unusual. And what I thought was that's some sort of an American eagle. And if you look at the photograph, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which seem to be feathers, like in the symbol of the American eagle, and there's secondary feathers motive going down there as well. Unfortunately, we don't see the rest of that. But I thought, I wonder if that can identify the building. So I started trawling the net and typing in all sorts of stuff. And as I usually do, I drew a blank. But then I came across this. One, two, three, four, five, six. And then there's primary, secondary feathers there. Jawohl, mein Führer. Anyway, I recalled, I have got a book on my Kindle reader. Obviously, it's not a Soviet agent here, or any agent. You don't know. I must say that John Kowalski, I showed this to John Kowalski, and he has other thoughts about Osborne's intelligence links, and it's not developed, the research. Needs more digging, if you can ever prove anything, but he's more inclined that Osborne was a British agent from the time after World War, before World War One, when Osborne left the British Army in 1914. But anyway, I got a book on my Kindle reader. It's called Oswald and the Doppelgangers. It's by another Canadian-born. I think he was a newspaper reporter. He's Jewish. A guy called Dov Ivry, who now lives in Israel. And in that book, he states that Albert Osborne was an ersatz clergyman domiciled in Mexico, whom the FBI knew when he lived in the United States during World War II as a Nazi collaborator. Unfortunately, Ivry doesn't add any notes in his book, as many of these book claims, and says you don't get notes and proof of solid evidence. So I did make a request when I recorded this for Lancer. If anybody had any ideas where that building was, we'll see what happens. When I was in Grimsby, in the Central Library in Grimsby, and their icons, and I got up early, 6 o'clock, and to avoid the M62 Grand Prix, and I got to Grimsby fairly early. I think it was barely 9 o'clock when I got into Grimsby, and so I spent the morning in the library and the archives, looking at stuff on the Lincolnshire Regiment and things like that. And I'd finished by about early afternoon. So I couldn't think of anything else to do. But I did have, from a newspaper, I had the address of Darrell Featherstone. And I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I drove around, had my sat-nav on, found his road, found his house, and just turned up unannounced. And fortunately, he was out on his drive in his garage, tinkering with his car. And I walked down the drive, and he come up to meet me, and I explained that I was a member of Dealey Plaza UK, and I was looking into Albert's involvement in the JFK case. And Darryl didn't want to really go there. He didn't want to talk to me. And the reason he gave, he said that, and this was in 2017, fairly recently, that the local press in Grimsby and the national press, I think it was the Sun, they descended on, and at this time, Darryl's mother and father were still alive, but in their 90s, and that's who the press wanted to get at. Darryl's father, Byron, and they weren't in the best of health. So Darryl said that instead of, he gave the press the interviews and what have you, and he was pressured into doing something. He gave the interviews, and after the story was published in local and national newspapers, he'd received a number of disturbing phone calls. And I didn't give up, and I appeared as friendly as, trying not to appear as a wacko conspiracy theorist or anything. So he eventually invited me in. There was just him in. His wife, I assumed, was out at work, and he still has the Bible Stories for Children book that Albert presented at Christmas '53, as well as that letter that was written to his father in 1964. So we chatted. I asked him if he thought Albert was involved in the JFK case. And I wasn't sure whether he was, still not sure whether he was playing me along. But he said, contrary to what was written in the letter from Mexico in 1964, where Albert writes, "I've not the slightest idea with travelling such a man." He told me that Albert told his father that he'd accompanied Oswald to Mexico City and brought him back again. Well, from the historical docs, he didn't bring him back, certainly. Well, as certain as you can be in anything. He also told me that Albert was a sharpshooter. So again, I'm not sure whether Darryl had been reading that nomenclature of an assassination quell. Don't know what perceptions or ideas that he developed over the years. So I asked him if he considered that because of the newspaper headlines, was his great uncle a spy? He just said that Uncle Albert was a shady character with more than one passport. And I think that's where you can only leave it. A shady character, that's perhaps the only truly provable description that you can put on the enigma that was Albert Osborne. As I said at the beginning, the research really on from my side of things, John Kowalski's done much more for longer, but with both of us on both sides, obviously with COVID, there's been no email or very few emails between us because nothing really that we can do. I'm looking for relatives of Albert in London, and I did appeal at one meeting in the Cheshire Cheese if anybody was interested in looking at National Archives. John is interested in digging for records of Bermuda. He's applied to Bermuda, and Bermuda have told him that all the records is shipped back, I assume, to Kew. So if anybody lives next door to there, and there's also two sisters, Ada and Florrie of Albert, who moved and got married and lived and died in London, and maybe they have siblings, descendant now that are still alive, still in London. The sisters are both passed away in the 1990s and 2000, but there may be people. The FBI chased these sisters in 1964, so maybe they have something that they know or think they know about Albert, and that's where we are. So I will have my hand butty, and I will sit back and thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter.
Don't ask me questions about Mexico City because I'm bamboozled.
All right, thanks a lot, Pete. That was really, really interesting. What a guy, very interesting guy. I don't trust a word he says, to be totally honest with you.
No.
Very interesting. No. Certainly somebody who could possibly be linked with the secret services. Who has that many passports and changed their name? Why? Who do?
He had the Osborne details in a false bottom of a bag.
Jesus. In
the digs where he was in San Antonio when he died. So we know he had different passports. But who was financing the guy?
Yeah.
As I said, that when you look at the travel from the Red Arrow bus into Mexico, back out of Mexico to New Orleans, to New York, flying across to England, and where he went from there, maybe in Europe or ice, or God knows. But then he's back in New York in early December, and then he's back in Mexico by January, where the FBI collar him, looking for John Howard Bowen. Then he's in second place he went to, can't remember. Can't remember, but he's somewhere in the States in February. Then in March, he's in Nashville. Who's financing all this? Somebody, there's evidence of him getting donations from people in women in associated with churches that he's supposedly doing his preaching at. But you know,
Well,
does that finance all that travel and everything? And I don't
I
know.
don't know.
Okay, Pete, thanks a lot for that. There is a question that I'm just going to throw at you. Hold on a minute. I'm just going to stop the recording here.